We already achieved a lot in this section, and I know that all this code looks kind of intimidating. And no worries, it will become much easier, but I find it super important to learn it the hard way first so that you never forget what's happening behind the scenes. Now, one crucial thing which I know that people often struggle with is that the order of execution of your code here is not necessarily the order in which you write it. For example, this here will actually execute after this code. So it will even execute after we already sent the response. This has two important implications. For one, sending the response does not mean that our event listeners here are dead. They will still execute even if the response is already gone. But it also means that if we do something in the event listener that should influence in the response, this is the wrong way of setting it up. We should then also move the response code into the event listener if we had such a dependency. But it also means that it's super important to understand that with request on or code like HTTP create server, these are some examples where Node.js uses a pattern where you pass a function to a function, and Node will execute these passed in functions at a later point of time, which is called asynchronously. Now, it's not always the case that a passed-in function is necessarily executed at a later point of time, but Node.js uses this pattern heavily, and throughout the course, I'll of course let you know when this is the case and when Node executes something asynchronously. In such cases, Node.js won't immediately run that function. Instead, what it does when it first encounters this line is it will simply add a new event listener internally. It manages all these listeners internally. In this case, for the end event on the request, which will be triggered automatically once Node.js is done parsing the request. So this is something Node.js does for you. And it will then call that function for you once it is done. So in the end, you can think of this like Node.js having some internal registry of events and listeners to these events. And a function like this is such a listener. And when something happens, so when Node.js is done parsing your request, it will go through that registry and see, I'm done with the request, so I should now send the end event. So let's see which listeners I have for that. And it will then find this function and any other functions you might have registered for that, and will now call them. But it will not pause the other code execution, and that is so important to understand. So for example, here now, since I moved return response end into this function, the flow is like this. It will now reach this if statement, and if these conditions are met, it will go inside of it. It will then register these two handlers and not immediately execute these two functions. Instead, the functions are just registered internally in its event emitter registry. And then it will jump straight away to the next line. And therefore, right now, if I would restart my server, save the code and restart my server here, you will see that if I enter something here, I actually get redirected to this page, or not even redirected, as you can see. There is no 300 status code. Instead, it just loads this page because it executes these lines. Because, as I now mentioned multiple times, it will not execute this right away, and this return statement will therefore not quit this overarching function here. Instead, it just registers this callback and immediately moves on to the next lines. And it would eventually execute this line, but that is already too late, which is also why we get the cannot set headers error here. Because it already moved along and executed this code, when all of a sudden the parsing of the request finished, and it executed this code and tried to again send a response, which obviously is too late, because it already did here. Now, I know that this is hard to wrap your head around, but it is a crucial concept that you can register code, functions, which run sometime in the future, but not necessarily right now. And therefore, the next line of code, this code here, can run or will run before this code, simply because this is just a callback to be called sometime in the future. And this setup is important because otherwise, Node would have to pause until it's done, pause until it wrote the file. And if it does that, it will simply slow our server down, and it's not able to handle our incoming requests or do anything of that kind until it's done. And that is not what we want. We don't want to block our code execution. We always want to be in that wait for new events loop, the event loop, and then only execute code once it's due to be executed, and never block that event loop for too long of a time. And this is why we have this setup. And this has one implication for this line and for this line. The implication for this line is that we reach it too early, so to avoid this, we should actually return here. We simply return request on so that this gets executed, but the line thereafter doesn't. And the important implication about this line will be discussed in the next lecture.